Off you go, Bob.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for making the long journey via cyberspace to be with us tonight. We looked like we really knew what was going on in light of the Southern Ontario weather we're having. I don't think I've ever seen this much snow in my entire life, so it's a pleasure not to have to even drive the short distance from my home to Weimar. So, anyway, thanks for joining us. Just a bit of club business to rush through. Remind everybody once again that the club dues are due. You can pay by e-transfer to treasurer at mpfn.xyz, or you can use snail mail to Box 393 Midland, Ontario L4R4L1. Or I guess you could wait until we resume in-person meetings. That's what, 2 months from now, and pay then. But no, we really don't want you to keep us holding on that long. A reminder to everybody that we're just a month away from spring, and we're also just a month away from the Sweetwater Harvest at Y March, which is March 22nd and 23rd at the Y Marsh Nature Center. Most of you know we're members of Ontario Nature. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but the executive director, Carolyn Schultz, is retiring after 19 years of service to Ontario Nature. She joined the Federation of Ontario Naturalists, the precursor to Ontario Nature, almost 40 years ago. Her message announcing her retirement says, among the most important work any of us can do is grassroots advocacy. And I think that's rather appropriate considering the topic tonight, the grasslands of native grasslands of Canada. So our speaker tonight, as you know, is Nicholas. I hope I'm saying this right. Ypelaar. Okay, and he's going to be talking on protecting the world's most endangered ecosystem, grasslands in Canada. I got a quick glimpse of a couple of his signs. We did a slides during a run through that we did, and it's very enticing. So I'm quite looking forward to this. Stick around after the meeting. We're going to have the questions and answers, and after that's done, we're hoping that everybody will tell us about their nature sightings. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ken to introduce the introducer of our guest speaker. Ken?
Hello again, everyone. And yep, just before we get started with next presentation, a couple of the rules and regs of how we operate. We'll have a question period afterwards. The best way to get your question in there is to use the chat function. You can print the question in there while Nick is talking, so you don't forget the question. And we'll review those at the end. Also at the end, though, if we're in the question period and you want to ask your question in person, have a little back and forth with Nick, all you have to do is unmute your microphone, maybe start up your camera and that type of thing. And the best way to get that done, somewhere in your controls, you should have a raise hand function. And if you raise your hand, we'll see that and then turn the floor over to you for your question. The other thing I say, we've got a lot of guests here tonight, and welcome to the Midland-Penetangushin Field Naturalists. If you're not a member, most of the time in our regular meetings, we ask guests to make a small contribution to help us with costs, $5 or something like that. And a little more trickier to do on Zoom, but it can be done. If you see behind me, you'll see an email address, treasurer@mpfn.xyz. And if you feel that this was a fantastic talk and you really should pay something for it at the end of the night, go ahead, do it. Make a e-transfer to treasurer@mpfn.xyz, and we promise to put those funds to good use. So with that, I'm going to search out Tim Tully, who knows our speaker very, very well. I think this is him. Let's put a spotlight on him.
Okay, I think I'm
okay. Tim, over to you. Tell us all about Nick Ypelaar.
Maybe not all about, but I'll give you the important snapshot. And hello to all. Hello to you, Nick. Hello to all those naturalists out there. An important community, and one that's all the more important in what is happening here in our area. And I know Nick feels very deeply about the area, not just Awenda Provincial Park. And Nick came to Awenda back, I believe it's 2017, Nick, that you
Yeah.
ventured in the door, and you wouldn't recognize him with his long hair now. And he had short hair and no beard, and was going to be heading off in the fall to study business at what was then even a different named university. And after spending a year, having come up here from Michael Power, and a mutual friend of ours, a former teacher of Nick's, recommended you just have to hire this guy. And I interviewed him, and he proved out to be the candidate, and he proved out to be one of the most incredible naturalists that I've worked with in my 37 years. Um, he worked with me for 6 years. I think I'm still missing my right hand, Nick. So that at some point you're going to have to give back to me. But seeing that progression from a young 18-year-old student to someone who then headed to U of T and studied conservation biology, and ended up with a degree, intersected with Niall Rawlinson, who Paul and I are long contemporaries in the interpretive world. And Niall I've known since probably he was 4 or 5. And for you, working with Niall was yet another full circle moment at Algonquin Park. But I know that your heart is with the little A, Awenda, not the big A, Algonquin. Uh, so it was a wonderful 6 years working with Nick, to see him progress, to see him contribute to the park. iNaturalist was something that was a huge beginning for us, and really brought in so many people, so many volunteers, and really a beginning for us of a really strong emphasis on resource management and species at risk research. So Nick was a part of all of that, and most proudly, I am pleased, even though he has deserted to our federal counterparts in the West. I can say without doubt that I have a lifelong friend, and someone who is without doubt, as you will see tonight, a gifted photographer. One of the people that Nick ran across at Awenda was a man named Bill Ivey, and Bill is one of those unsung heroes of tiny township and nature photography in general. And I think Nick found his place underneath Bill's wing, and from video to photography, and then seeing him blossom on his own is something that I think you're all going to really enjoy tonight. I must admit, Nick, I think I have the hockey flu. Go, I want to go. But I will promise that I will keep your presentation on, and I might not hear all of your comments, but I look forward to hearing more about the presentation. In fact, I think we hope to maybe squeeze in a rendezvous, but we'll see how that rolls. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce my friend, fellow naturalist extraordinaire, gifted photographer, Nick Ypelaar of Grasslands. It takes a long time for me to get used to this national park. So Nick, knock them dead, and your images will certainly do that. So with that, have a great presentation.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction there, Tim. And I see some familiar names and faces on the call here. And for those of you that I know and that I don't know, you'll know that Tim is the master interpreter, and he's also really good at making everything appear a lot better than it may seem. So Tim set the bar really high, and maybe let's just bring down those expectations a little bit. I'm rusty in my virtual interpretation, but I'm going to do my best to give everyone a good overview here of Grasslands National Park and some of the work that I do for Parks Canada there. So I think I will share my screen there, and I'll go to my slideshow, and maybe Ken or somebody can give me a thumbs up that everyone can see my screen there on my presentation.
I think you're good, Nick.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, Tim, for that phenomenal introduction there. It's really kind, and I'm very lucky to have worked with you, Tim, and with a lot of people on this call. I recognized some names and faces there, and it was absolute pleasure to cross paths with you. And it's so nice that we're here today. Thank you to Ken and Bob for facilitating this meeting with the Midland-Penetang Field Naturalists. As Ken said there at the beginning, if you're able to and have the ability, a donation to the MPFN really makes a big difference. And facilitating presentations like this is a big deal, especially for nature interpretation and cultural heritage in Canada right now. So really, thank you for having me here. And I'm going to dive right into this presentation here. And as my title suggests there, protecting the world's most endangered ecosystem, grasslands in Canada. I'm going to talk a little bit about native prairie in our wonderful country and give sort of the overview from a Grasslands National Park perspective. So our Parks Canada and our Federal Parks Agency, who currently employs me there. So I'll dive right in here. And I guess before I continue with my presentation a little bit further, I just want to acknowledge that Grasslands National Park, it's and the surrounding area is a Treaty 4 territory, which are prairies that are home to Indigenous nations who for a millennium linked their lives to the migration of buffalo, not just in Canada, but throughout the Great Plains of North America. And they linked their lives to these wonderful animals that I'll talk a little bit more about later. But some of these nations include the Ananeen, the Nakota, the Nihiawak, the Siksika, Dakota, Lakota, and the Métis people of Canada. So I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and play on such an incredible landscape and to have protected areas like parks, not just national parks, but provincial parks and protected areas throughout our country. We're very lucky in Canada. And one of my larger experiences from working in parks is being able to share protected areas with people, visitors, and naturalists like yourselves, and enthusiasts and campers who come and experience landscapes like this. So really grateful to work in an organization that sort of protects this landscape and allows us this opportunity to share it with people, and everything that's so important about it. I'll just give a little bit of outline here. I'm just gonna introduce myself. I know Tim did a great job there, but I'll give some background and then of course talk about Grasslands National Park, just some native mixed grass prairie information, some of the species at risk, including maybe our burrowing owl that you'll see on the screen there, and some of the work that we do at Grasslands to sort of protect these species at risk, and then the overall protection and restoration for native prairie, which is an endangered ecosystem, not just in Canada, but worldwide. It's the most endangered ecosystem in the world. So needs all the protection it can get. And a little bit about me, as Tim mentioned. So I have my undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto, and without Mr. Tim Tully sort of setting me on the amazing path of natural heritage education and history, I'd probably still be I'd be chained to a different kind of desk in the business world, perhaps. And after growing up in Etobicoke in the west side of Toronto, I was very lucky to do a lot of camping throughout Ontario growing up. So thank you to my parents for facilitating that when I was younger. But really that opportunity to work at Awenda Provincial Park as a young teenager was very formative. And Tim has given not just myself, but so many other young people in the Midland area and Midland-Penetang area, and even a wider net, that belief and opportunity to get paid to be a naturalist and get paid to work in a biological setting and capacity there. So huge shout out again to Tim and all the folks at Awenda Provincial Park. I am currently the interpretation coordinator at Grasslands National Park. So that's my job and that's where I'm coming from. So I am really lucky in that I have that sort of balance between nature interpretation and education, and then also that research and resource management and conservation side of things. It's sort of my job to explain the science and things that go on at national parks and sort of present that and interpret that to park visitors and campers. And of course, as Tim mentioned there, very lucky to have spent 6 years and 8 seasons at Awenda Provincial Park in the Ontario Park System. So there's Tim, as you mentioned a little earlier, with a young Nick there, a lot less hair. And again, a shout out to the Friends of Awenda Park as well, who support research and education in Awenda Provincial Park. If you're not already a member of the Friends of Awenda, I would highly recommend you look to support that. They provide an opportunity for youth like myself to have a chance to learn and spend time in the outdoors and facilitate that opportunity there. And as we've alluded to a little bit here, I also throughout my undergrad had the very lucky opportunity to work with Professor Niall Rowlandson out of the University of Toronto and help him and some of his graduate students at the Algonquin Wildlife Research Station, which along with some awesome resource conservation and management work that I did at Awenda, this opportunity at U of T really gave me a view into applied research and conservation at a really interesting study system that I think Niall was your last month's presenter there. So I'm sure some of you will be familiar with some of the long-term study of freshwater turtles and breeding amphibian populations as well there at Algonquin. But all this to say that last year, after some thinking and deliberating, I decided to trade the shores of Georgian Bay and travel almost 3,500 kilometers across Canada to the prairies, the native prairies of Grasslands National Park. And to provide some context there, Grasslands is actually in the southwest corner of Saskatchewan there, right on the Montana border there, and sort of the heart of native mixed grass prairie in Canada. And there's another view of our placement in Saskatchewan, really far south in the province. A lot of people and friends, when I told them I was moving to Saskatchewan, they were sort of saying, "Oh, it's so flat there, you know, you're going to go to this area." But I was quite surprised and interested to learn about the variety of topography throughout the province of Saskatchewan. It's not all that flat, as I'll discuss a little bit later. But Grasslands National Park here too is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's part of the Great Plains of North America ecoregion, and really sort of the northern Great Plains is what we call it here on the this side of Canada, which stretches all the way to central Alberta, sort of at its northernmost range, and all the way down to northern Texas. Really is where our Great Plains of North America stretch out. And Grasslands is right in the heart there, and I think this map here notes that the west central semi-arid prairies, which I'll talk about, there's many different names and demarcations for our sort of different ecosystems that we have here within a prairie landscape as well. But Grasslands itself was established in 1981 as a national park. It is the only park out of 48 national parks in the Parks Canada system that protects native prairie. And it is the largest intact section of native prairie in Canada. So I'll explain a little further what that exactly means. It's home to 30 species at risk, and we usually put 30 plus here because there's always new species of at risk. Either they're being listed or relisted on our species at risk registry, and sometimes we're finding new species every year, whether that's a different type of moth or a new type of bird that maybe has found breeding evidence within the park. So 30 plus species at risk call Grasslands National Park home, and it is known as the darkest place in Canada. And a little personal fun fact from me is I remember when I started working in parks at Awenda there, and I was thinking of maybe places I'd want to visit. I remember seeing an ad or a photo on Facebook about Grasslands National Park, and it was a view from a similar location in the park of this beautiful skyscape here with a beautiful Milky Way shot, and the caption was about how Grasslands National Park, darkest place in Canada. And I said to myself, one day I'm going to go visit there. And sure enough, I ended up working there. And I've spent many hours exploring the night skies of not only Ontario, but now Saskatchewan. And being one of the darkest places in Canada, it's a great place for Aurora Borealis viewing. And this was taken, I think, last October. We had a really good solar flare there that resulted in this beautiful view there. But as I mentioned before, so largest intact native prairie in Canada. So Grasslands National Park in total is about 906 square kilometers, or 90,000 hectares of protected area. It's actually split up into two separate blocks. We have a west block and an east block of the park. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but in total, you know, they're split pretty equal of size there. So protected area total of over 600 square kilometers, and that intact area probably about half of that, so 450 square kilometers of intact native prairie. Nowhere else in Canada is there such a protected continuous area of prairie. But native prairie, I always like to differentiate this when I'm talking about things. And a lot of you I know are keen naturalists, so you might already be familiar with some of these definitions and explanations. So I apologize if it's elementary to you all, but or to some of you. But native prairie, I like to differentiate from just a agricultural setting or grassland setting. People come to Grasslands National Park on my guided hikes or programs in the summer, and they say, well, why is prairie endangered? There's so much of it, right? Like all of Saskatchewan is prairie and so much of Manitoba is prairie. But when we're talking about native prairie ecosystems, we're talking about plants that are indigenous to the area, grassland plants, not just agricultural crops or non-native species or invasive species that are covering large swaths of land. And native prairie can be distinguished by that very high and diverse terrestrial grassland ecosystem. So a high biodiversity of plant and animals, concentration that typically has a higher ratio of biodiversity than other ecotypes. And the key thing with native prairie is it is like an upside down forest in many senses. So people don't realize, especially in our age of climate change and global warming there, we think about carbon storage in trees and forests as being a really important mediator in keeping the global climate in check there. But grasslands, native grasslands, are hugely important for climate change and carbon storage. So the phrase upside down forest is often used when we're talking about native grasslands. And that simply refers to the fact that a native grass species, like this one here on the slide, that's a species called blue grama grass. It gets its name when it's ready to seed. It's got that seed head that sort of looks like eyelashes. It'll turn like a blue color, and people think it looks like your grandma's fake eyelashes there. It's quite large in size, but that'll turn a shade of bluish color when it's ready to deposit its seed. And seed, when an animal brushes up against it, will sort of latch on to the fur or is blown away in the wind like that. It's a very small grass species. On average, it grows between 20 to 30 centimeters tall. But the root system for this very small grass species actually run up to 2 meters deep. So that's a huge difference of native species with a root system that's going deep into the semi-arid soils in our native grassland and searching for water and storing so much carbon from its mass, its biomass. Typically, native grass species biomass, 90% or between 80 and 90% of that is under the ground. So what you see on the surface is a lot less than what we've got in front of us, or underneath our feet, I should say. And again, that native prairie is so important for its absorption and storage of billions of tons of carbon annually. So really important to have native ecosystems of grass. And as I mentioned before, you know, native grasslands are really important for high levels of terrestrial biodiversity. So here's a few species that you might find in Grasslands National Park. As I mentioned, over 30 species at risk in the park. Some of these are on there. We've got our burrowing owl on the top. I don't know if I've got a laser pointer there, but we've got our burrowing owl on the top, then our chestnut-colored longspur for our birds there, and our western meadowlark or a loggerhead shrike and ferruginous hawk, I think, is on this slide, and then some of our key mammals that are quite popular and only found in Grasslands National Park are black-tailed prairie dog, and then other mammals, of course, plains bison and their native habitat, pronghorn, American badger, and prairie rattlesnake, just to name a few examples there of some of the biodiversity that you get in this native prairie ecosystem. And in addition to that, 70 species, over 70 species of grass. Again, always new species are being discovered or found in the park or registered. So I put the 70 plus there. And Grasslands is sort of unique in that its location is at the mixed grass prairie. And what that means is it's the transition zone between our taller eastern grasses and our western short grasses. So on the right of the screen here, we got little blue stem, which is a species of grass typically more associated with the eastern part of Canada and North America. And then on the left, I've got our needle and thread grass, which is a really unique species of grass there. It grows quite interesting way with those seed heads there, that the or the tail of it dries up like a spiral, and the needle point will literally stab. I've had so many guided hikes where at the end of the hike, I'm pulling these needles out of my socks because they literally impale themselves. And that's, of course, an adaptation to stick onto bison fur or other mammal fur or anything like that and be transported throughout the prairie. And then the neat thing about needle and thread grass is when it dries out and falls off of an animal's fur there and lands on, again, that very hard, dry prairie soil, the wind will actually blow through that tail that's sort of dried out and spiral, and the wind will cause, and you can see actually the sort of stem or middle part there of our seed head is almost like twisted, again, like a spiral. And when the wind blows through that, it causes it to drill into the ground. So really neat adaptation to this very harsh prairie environment. But Grasslands National Park, that transition zone between all these different species of grass, giving it such a high biodiversity. But I'm sort of jumping ahead here because I want to explain a little bit about that mixed grass prairie idea here. And this is sort of a view of prairie grasslands in Canada there. And we can see there's sort of a difference between our parklands and then our moist mixed grass prairie, and grasslands right there in the star, that's in the heart of our mixed grass prairie. But mixed grass prairie, as I mentioned, is not only that transition zone between the eastern and western parts, but it's also a very harsh wilderness environment. So it's characterized by a very semi-arid environment. So it's like a desert. There's less than 30 centimeters of annual precipitation, and about a third of that is snow. So when you're thinking of even just precipitation got in Midland in the past few weeks of snow alone is well above 30 centimeters. So a lot of the precipitation we get here in grasslands is not very high. So a lot of the grass species, animal species, need to be really adapted to this harsh environment to survive on very little water. That's why the native species are so well adapted to grow that root system so deep into the ground to reach and get any moisture from deep under. And I also like to point out, this is a great example of one of our more popular hiking areas there. It doesn't look very flat to me when I look at that. So I always laugh. This grasslands is part of the Frenchman River Valley, which is that south part of Saskatchewan. And the water sort of drains from Cypress Hills area all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico there. So sort of neat in that it drains south of the continental divide there, and all that meltwater from glaciers thousands of years ago carved out these river valleys that we call, coulees, and these somewhat mountainous features that you'll see are sort of are called buttes, and they're anything but flat. So it's a really tough terrain, not only for animals but also for humans and hikers. And I know a few people were mentioning at the beginning they've had the chance to visit to grasslands at various points, and I think you'll probably share that sentiment that it's a pretty harsh wilderness, and it's neat when we think about the animals and plants that inhabit it, and then as well as the humans that have lived there in the past for millennium. Yeah. And another view of a coulee there, so that river valley that's been carved out by meltwater from glaciers is anything but flat. But why is native prairie endangered? So I mentioned at the start of this program that we're talking about the most endangered ecosystem in the world. And I think a big part of that, well, I know a big part of that is due to grassland conversion and human activity. But I think people are surprised that grasslands are maybe the most endangered or ecosystem in the world, because they don't think about how important it is, or they forget that when we're converting grasslands to agricultural landscapes or for human activity and development, how often, that causes a huge decline in the biodiversity of that area. So it's sort of an interesting dichotomy there, because we all need to eat. I'm very grateful that we live in a country where we can have food and go to the grocery store and pick up things, and especially, grasses and rices and things like that that are grown in areas like Canada like this. So it's sort of that balance, right, between converting grasslands that we can have agricultural practices that can sustain us here in our own country, especially domestically, more now than ever. But then also that balance of maintaining a very important habitat that is so important for many species in Canada here. And some of you may be familiar with this sort of graph here. This is actually from Birds Canada's State of Birds report that came out last fall. And that was sort of a big undertaking and catalog of study of birds throughout Canada. And they sort of noted in that study that grassland birds are disproportionately affected, more than any other type of bird here, and that the decline is upwards of 65% there in bird populations since 1970 there. So our grasslands are really taking a hit in recent times due to that grassland conversion to agricultural fields and to human development stuff. So the sort of interesting, sad but interesting fun fact is that every year 60,000 hectares of fields of native grasslands disappear. So again, we're talking about that difference between a native prairie with those species that store a lot of carbon in their roots and are home to so many different variety of plant and animals there, are being converted into monocultures or agricultural settings, or human development for cities and things like that, urban sprawl, all of these things. And again, this is sort of an example. This was a figure here from the Conservation Research Institute. It's quite a few years old, but there's a few grass species here that are found in Grasslands National Park, and probably some eastern ones as well. I see that are found in Ontario, but it just displaying here the difference between lawn grass on the left side of the graph and that's of course an example, an extreme example of a recreation type species there, versus native species and how deep their roots go. So 6 feet deep for quite a few of these species, and some even longer. So when you're thinking about even soil stabilization and things like that, how important that is to have native species as opposed to non-native and invasive species. And here's a little figure from National Geographic Creative just showing the difference between perennial and annual plants there. So our typical agricultural setting versus our native, and the root system this gentleman is holding up here illustrates that quite well. And an example too of just another one of these bird species that is sort of neat with prairie grasslands, and a big point I want to hammer home about protected areas and Grasslands National Park is the scale and size of protected areas. When we're talking about grasslands in particular, because it's got such a high biodiversity, there's a lot of different microhabitats within the larger park setting that are really important to facilitate breeding territory and appropriate population minimum size needed for these species. So a species like the chestnut-colored longspur here, population has decreased by 95% since 1970, according to that Birds Canada report there. And it's sort of neat when we think about it. People think about grasslands as needing to be completely untouched, and they need tall grass and things like that to sustain all the species. But what we find from looking at species like chestnut-colored longspurs, they actually need grasses that are grazed. They need the native prairie, and they need species like needle-and threadgrass and western shortgrass and things like that, but they need to be grazed or disturbed in some sense. They like shorter grass to lay their eggs in, with sort of outcroppings like this one perched on this male for singing purposes to defend its territory. But it also needs a large minimum breeding area. So 39 hectares is no small feat there. So it's all about finding that balance for the most representative habitats or microhabitats within our larger intact prairie, for the most species that need it. So there's a lot of interesting departments within Grasslands National Park that sort of work on various species at risk and how we can best manage the land and provide habitat, not just for one, but for as many as possible, especially those species at risk that we know their population is declining. Can we, provide them home and sanctuary? And even more so difficult when the species is a songbird like this, it's migratory, right? It's not just our actions here in Canada that dictate the survival of this bird, but also south of the border and in their overwintering habitats. So interesting case study there. But I'll just talk a little bit more about the specific work we do at Grasslands National Park. I'll speak a little more to my specific experiences helping out with different units of our resource conservation team, including as well as some of the more general units that we have here in the park. So protection and restoration here at the park, we focus a lot on the invasive species there. So in addition to that habitat destruction or conversion, I guess, a lot of the issues, degradation of habitat. So when we have invasive species and non-native species invading and outcompeting our native species, it can really degrade the quality of habitat and is not too conducive to species like chestnut-collared longspur and other endangered species that need very specific habitat needs there. Our native grasslands restoration goes hand in hand with our bison and grazing at the park, as well as some of our other species at risk monitoring that goes on in the park there. So some interesting photos there on the side. You'll see a black-tailed prairie dog, again, not found anywhere else in Canada. They're sort of at their northern range limit in grasslands, and it's the only place in Canada where you find that species. And perched next to it there, it's doing a territorial display, what we call a jump yip, where it sort of jumps up and sort of lets people know that burrow belongs to that specific male there. You'll see a loggerhead shrike perched behind it, sort of curiously looking. And then, of course, a burrowing owl, again, doing what they do best on the side there. And sort of interesting, too, with species interaction in that our burrowing owl, they can nest in other locations, but they really like prairie dog towns because they're like the perfect size. It's like a Goldilocks situation for our burrowing owl, which don't dig their own nests. They occupy burrows created by prairie dogs in this case. So invasive species, there's quite a few, but these are sort of the top 5 that Grasslands sort of focuses on. There's a lot of removal and prescribed burns that happen to get rid of leafy spurge in particular is a big action species that we're trying to remove, both with chemical spray and also manual cutting and removal and things like that. And it's all part of that mission to sort of preserve and protect native prairie from these species that are not native to the area. Excuse me. And our native grasslands restoration. So this is sort of an interesting one that I didn't realize before I worked at the park how big of a scale this operation is. But the reseeding, seed collection, and plug planting in grasslands is really a huge operation. So there's a unit of our resource conservation team that really tackles this. And I think, yeah, over here I've got this photo here of a seed collector. So we've got sort of an all-terrain vehicle or a utility terrain vehicle there, and this is sort of a custom built tow behind piece that we've got, and what it does is sort of goes over our native grass species there at the end of the summer when they're ready to seed, and it'll sort of knock off all the seed heads and sort of collect them in the bottom of this trailer here, and then we take them back and we will sort through the seed and sort of distribute them and clean the seed heads off them, any of the chaff that need to get out. And then the following year, well, depending on the schedule of things, we'll go and we'll actually reseed some of these native grass species. So you can see there's that first unit there behind the tractor is a seeding thing. And then we've also got sort of a roller that comes up behind and makes sure those seeds are really deposited deep into that harsh soil there. So it's all part of this sort of framework of naturalizing and making our native plants, making sure they have a home in our native prairie. And sort of on that note as well, I mentioned that Grasslands National Park is sort of separated into two blocks here. So this is a somewhat outdated map here, but this is from our official Parks Canada website there of Grasslands National Park's west and east blocks. And you'll notice the sort of framework of the park is not exactly typical for a protected area, for example, but it's really neat with grasslands is when the park was founded or established in 1981, it was formed on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. So what that means is this land was actually owned by ranchers. And these ranchers sort of, unlike some of the farmers in further north in Saskatchewan, these ranchers never actually tilled the land. They had their own cattle that they let graze the area there. So a lot of the plant and the seed bank in there is native grass plant species. And what happens is the park acquired different blocks, starting with the main block on the west block of the park. That huge chunk right in the center of that green area there was all owned by a gentleman named Walt Larson, and he was the first person to sell to the federal government, and he was sort of the basis for starting this system there. And the park gradually, since 1981, has been acquiring more and more chunks of land in the park area. There was habitat assessments sort of done whenever there was a willing seller and willing buyer here, and our park biologists would go out and sort of evaluate and do a bio blitz and ecological assessment of the ecological integrity of that land. So there was a decision made in between the two blocks of the park. That's about I want to say 150 to 200 kilometer distance between the two. That land was actually deemed to not be a good enough quality for acquisition by the park. So during that area could have been reseeded or changed to tilled and planted with agricultural or non-native species sort of taken over. So there's no plan currently to sort of connect the two blocks, but those two areas that you see in the map are areas that were high in native species there and were acquired by the park to sort of protect what was intact prairie grassland there. And slowly over time, that sort of expanded. The west block of the park is sort of around 90% full of what the original management plan was in the 80s of what they were hoping to kind of acquire and form the park with. And I think the east block is a little bit more behind. There's probably about 60% complete of what they envisioned of land acquisition there. So an interesting thing too with the park is when the park was established in 1981, they ceased all grazing and they removed all the cattle from the area there, and they left it for 20 years. And after 20 years in the early 2000s, they realized that the health of the ecosystem was actually decreasing quite a bit. And they realized that grazing was such an integral part to the health and ecological integrity of these grasslands that even though there weren't bison were unfortunately brought to near extinction in the 1800s, and by 1880 there was less than 1,000 bison in North America. But even without bison, there was still cattle on the landscape by these ranchers who sort of let their cattle free roam and graze the landscape, keeping it in check, creating that heterogeneity of habitat for species like our chestnut call longspur that like really short grass, and other species like our Sprague's pipit who maybe like a little bit longer grass and things like that. So by leaving the land ungrazed for 20 years, we realized the health of the ecosystem was going down. So we were actually able to reintroduce bison in 2005. There were 71 plains bison brought into Grasslands National Park, returned to the native prairie where they belong. From Elk Island National Park is where there's a big sort of source or sink population of bison in the Parks Canada system. And since 2005, 71 individuals sort of grew to about 500, and 600 is sort of what we have as a current bison number. And every 2 years, we run them through a bison handling facility. And that number is sort of brought back down to 400-ish because there are no natural predators in Grasslands National Park. There's no wolves that have been reintroduced. The bison don't really have any natural stressors or predators, so we sort of play that role as a management to remove those 200 bison, and some of them are sent out to Indigenous communities around Canada, and some are sent to other national parks to sort of maintain that genetic integrity and keep that healthy throughout our Parks Canada populations throughout the country. So really neat that bison now are back on the landscape, and they are sort of now playing the role of grazers again, as they did thousands of years ago. Prescribed burns is another thing that we sort of do in certain areas of the park. As mentioned a little bit earlier, it's an effective control for some of our invasive species, and we also, some species need that sort of reset to ground zero with prescribed burn to sort of or reinvigorate the seed bank and give things a chance to regrow. And species at risk monitoring, as I mentioned before, over 30 species at risk. Some of our endangered species there are listed. I won't go through them all, but all of this information is available on Grasslands National Park webpage there on the Government of Canada. But here's a few of sort of the endangered ones and threatened. There's also what Canada federal government categorizes as our species of special concern. And then, yeah, that makes up our species at risk monitoring there. So quite a few species. We typically sort of separate with our biologists that focus maybe on our bird species and then reptiles. And we have whole teams for our black-tailed prairie dog because of their density and importance as ecosystem engineers, as well as our plains bison are managed by our bison coordinator there. And you can see sort of the cooperation between our burrowing owl and our black-tailed prairie dog there on the burrow. And yeah, endangered in Canada, our burrowing owl. It's sort of neat with grasslands as we can really see we have very extensive monitoring programs for our burrowing owl. So we have our specialist who goes out in the breeding season. We'll do mating counts and then also breeding counts afterwards to see if they're successful in nesting on specific burrows. And within 4 years there, from 2019, where we registered 12 breeding pairs of burrowing owls, we're up to over 70. I don't quite have our official figures from last year, but I think it was more than 70 breeding pairs. I'm unsure of how many are successful, but as of 2023, 51 pairs were successful in producing fledglings for our burrowing owl. And again, that's a species that has a massively long migration all the way as far as Mexico for some individuals. And some of the ones in grasslands maybe don't always make it as far and will end up overwintering in some of the southern US states. But really neat to see that progression over time in such short order. And in addition to sort of our monitoring of burrowing owls, there's actually a program where we provide supplementary feeding for some of our nests. So our burrowing owl specialist, when she's going out and monitoring where our burrowing owls are later in the season, when we think that they have successful nestings, will go and deposit some we call them micicles, and that would be frozen mice into the burrow to give our fledglings a little bit of a boost, or I guess before they're even fledged, our young recently hatched owls there. So pretty neat to see that it is successful with such an increase in breeding pairs and successfully producing fledglings. Another species at risk that I've had the lucky ability to help out quite a bit on is our greater shorthorn lizard. So greater shorthorn lizard is the only lizard species in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and it's pretty neat that Grasslands National Park sort of holds the majority. 96% of all the lizards in Saskatchewan are in Grasslands National Park, and the park does annual abundance and occupancy surveys. So these guys are really neat. They're actually quite small lizards. And they are really adapted to that prairie environment. So they give birth to live young, and although they're about the size of my palm, a gravid female can give birth to upwards of 10 baby neonate greater shorthorn lizards, which aren't that small. So it's kind of funny when you see one and it's about the size of your palm, and you think about how it can fit up to 10 individual baby lizards inside of it. It's pretty remarkable. And they sort of burrow in the slopes of Grasslands National Park on those buttes and coulees that I showed a little bit earlier. Anywhere there's sort of open exposed soil and gets a little bit of sun, they're able to sort of burrow in there and hibernate over the winter. And of course, one of the most famous species at risk is the greater sage grouse. And this is perhaps one of the most challenging conservation efforts that we have here at the park. Greater sage grouse are critically endangered in Canada. There's less than 250 pairs in Grasslands National Park, and perhaps a similar amount in Canada. I know there's still some populations in southern Alberta as well. Um, and there's a big effort to sort of support their populations in the park and in Canada. However, it can be quite difficult. There's a lot of predators for them, especially in grasslands. It's interesting with the agricultural or I guess the human ranching, not necessarily agricultural, but cattle ranching in the area has provided sort of people have dug watering holes and things like that, or put up fences in various areas that provide sort of a lookout and an unfair advantage to predators such as great horned owls, and then corvids like the black-billed magpie, and crows and ravens are actually corvids are actually one of the number one predators of greater sage-grouse eggs. They're smart enough to sort of follow a lekking male. So this is what the male is doing. A group of males will sort of compete with those I'm forgetting the name of it, but they've got those chest things that allow them to make really interesting sounds, and sort of vocal sacs, that's what they're called. Our vocal sacs expand there, and they'll sort of do a dance and a song to try and attract females. And what the corvids will do is they'll actually follow the females who have sort of mated with our male here, and they'll follow it back to its nest and then wait for it to lay its eggs, and then they'll go and steal the eggs. So they're really smart, and they know how to perch onto man-made structures or even trees that normally wouldn't be on the prairie. When we're thinking of a native prairie hundreds of years ago, trees would have been toppled over by bison pretty regularly, but because of their elimination from the landscape, certain trees have grown in there. And great horned owls are similar subsidized predators from a landscape perspective that are predators of adults and young greater sage grouse. So in efforts, and greater sage-grouse, I will add as well, they're not the smartest birds. Sometimes they'll fly into trees and bushes and fences like this one, grasslands, because we're still in an area that's sort of surrounded by private ranching property or different sections of the park. We do still have fences that are set up quite along the way to keep private cattle from breeding with bison or just getting into disagreements with bison. So a lot of these fences, greater sage-grouse will fly into them and decapitate themselves or hurt themselves on the fences because they can't see them, right? So a big action for a resource conservation team is actually going out with these little plastic fence markers and putting them along the fences there to make sure that they're seen by the greater sage grouse and not flying in. On the left-hand side of the screen here, you'll see one of our resource conservation technicians. He's putting up a perch deterrent on top of one of the signs there, and that's to stop giving an unfair advantage to predators like a great horned owl or ferruginous hawk, which would perch in that on a landscape where normally there wouldn't be similar perches for it. So it's difficult, but we're making the most, and every day and year there's sort of different ways that we're trying to conserve and protect our species at risk and our landscape in Grasslands National Park. But the main thing that I sort of want to hammer home, or I guess my thoughts on the matter, is that the perspective is that bigger is better, right? These protected areas are really important, but having a very large protected area with a variety of habitat and microhabitats, that heterogeneity of the landscape allows for a variety of species to not only survive, but thrive. So when we're looking at, protected areas like Awenda Provincial Park, with only 29 square kilometers, and then we look at grasslands, which is substantially larger, again because of various circumstances such as human residence and things like that. But it's that scale is really important for protecting species, and I'm sure Tim and many people on this call here will advocate that it would be so amazing to have massive parks everywhere, but that's not always possible. But in the areas that we do have them, it's really important that we keep them the way they are and sort of keep them intact, because all those habitat influences really can impact the species that call home. So just in Canada as well, our largest national park, Wood Buffalo National Park, are 44,000 square kilometers. Really important habitat there for a whole manner of species. like wood bison, so different subspecies from our plains bison and grasslands. But again, that massive landscape, and they have gray wolves and other species on that landscape that need that large roaming range to survive. And then when we're thinking of grasslands elsewhere in the world, the Serengeti Mara ecosystem is actually a trans-country one. So between Kenya and northern Tanzania, they're 40,000 square kilometers. So similar to wood buffalo, but we think of, species in our grasslands and how they're able to survive. It's because they have that larger scale, that size there. So when I run for prime minister one day, you can all vote for me and I'll make our parks as big and as wonderful as possible. So that's my little plug there of national parks there. And a special thank you again to Tim Tully for really setting me on this path of natural heritage education and interpretation. I would not be here today if it wasn't for Tim. So thank you, Tim, for taking me under your wing and putting up with me for over 6 years as a young teenager there. Really greatly appreciated. And a huge shout out to Deepthi Rajapakse there. So I don't think she's on the call right now. I know she's in BC there visiting with family, but Deepthi, awesome human, and I know a really great member of the Midland Penetang field naturalists there. And have a lot of great memories and stories of her telling me about many of your adventures here as a organization there. So thanks, Deepthi, for passing my name on to Ken and Bob there, and really happy to be able to chat with you guys this evening. Thank you all for listening. Thanks again, Ken and Bob, for having me, and I'll close this one out here for now with the screen share, and then pass it over to you, Ken. Oh yeah, there's some black-footed ferrets I added in there just in case anyone has questions. But yeah.
Well, I think you can always screen share again later if you want. To
For
show.
sure, yeah.
And Deepthi doesn't usually join these meetings. She doesn't have great reception out in Salog Bay. She could have in Vancouver probably, but she always watches the videos that we share later. And
Right on.
anybody that joined late, we will be sending out a video to people on the call. But that was great, Nick, and we do have some questions here.
For sure.
There's somebody on that I don't know, Aya Hayashi. I think I identified themselves as a member of the Manitoulin Nature Club. And I has come up with some questions here. Let's see. Is there any study of surrounding environment before and after the national park, campground, and car parks were built? I'm curious about the maintenance of healthy underground water network.
Yeah, that is a great question there. So there's definitely, it's an interesting thing with the campgrounds and the car parks as well. There aren't too many car park areas. A lot of the roads that the park uses were actually roads that were established by the ranchers who owned the property, or they were old sort of ranching roads or property roads that people use. So a lot of that was sort of built in, at least from the early 1900s onwards. But there's sort of a main road throughout the 2 blocks of the park, and there is sort of that ecological integrity assessment that went into before the park was formed. The campground itself, it was sort of interesting with the establishment of that in the early 2000s, in that they had a greater sage-grouse protection order that was drawn up in a certain area of the park that was set out by the federal government. They passed a legislation that within a certain area you cannot build any structure whatsoever because it's critical nesting habitat for the greater sage-grouse, and building any sort of structure would be giving an unfair advantage to predators like that great horned owl or ferruginous hawk. But the problem was they drew on the map where that protection order area was, they put it in the wrong place. It wasn't supposed to be in the campground area because the campground in particular was designed and placed in an area where there was a little more disturbance. So a lot of crested wheatgrass and other non-native species that were planted by former landowners to sort of harvest for the winter to feed their cattle with. So for that, it's sort of interesting with the campground. If you have the chance to visit Grasslands, you'll notice there's no shower facility there, and all the signs are below below 1.5 meters in height. And that's to sort of, because we're not allowed to build anything new there, and we're not allowed to build anything over a certain height in that area. In terms of the maintenance of healthy underwater water, I'm not too sure about that. I know there is water source there, because we do have that, and I think it's chlorinated for like potability in the summer for sure. Another thing too, there used to be, I think, above ground power lines that were put in probably sometimes in the 1960s or 70s, I would to guess. And I think as recently as 2009 or maybe the early 2010s, they removed those and put them under the ground again. Same thing to sort of keep that native prairie as an open, expanded area. Yeah, I apologize if that doesn't answer your question about the underwater network. I'm not too sure, but it is interesting with the Frenchman River that sort of rips through that west block of the park there. There is that water source that is providing sustenance for a lot of the species there, including moose. I was quite surprised to see that there are moose in Grasslands National Park.
Well,
Great
and
question, though.
you had a second question on there, but I think maybe in the typing, it looks a little garbled. It's hard to understand. So you might want to put it in the chat again, or if you raise your hand, we can recognize you. You could ask it in person. But in the meantime, we have a raised hand from Jude. Jude, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Nick. It's Jude. I just wanted to say thank you. I've had the pleasure of coming to Grasslands 3 times, and we always stay at both blocks. And so the last time we were there was 2 years ago. And thank you for clarifying the spikes on top of the posts. We thought they were for the northern shrikes to put their prey on.
Right on.
So we were like,
Well,
oh, isn't that
do
so nice
they
in
do
the
that?
park?
Do they do that at all?
It's funny that you mentioned that, Jude, and that's awesome. You've had the chance to visit both blocks of the park, because they are very different too, as well. I don't have as much time as I would like to, but there's sort of some unique differences between that. But yeah, it's funny that you mentioned those perch deterrents, and Ken as well brought up a good point there. I haven't seen evidence of the loggerhead shrikes using the perch deterrents for spiking things, but on a lot of our fences, well, not a lot of them, but certain areas in the fences, we have found, mice and other birds that have been impaled upon our barbed wire fences. So there is sort of an advantage in that sense, but it's sort of a difficult one. And they tend, I think, to like to use the buffalo bush for impaling their prey, and they'll still sort of nest, and you can sort of figure out where their nests are by looking for, garter snakes and other animals that have been impaled on buffalo bush. But there is certain areas in the park where the barbed wire fences are used by the loggerhead shrikes for sure. And yeah, that's great that you got to visit the park. And hopefully, if you're ever through the area again, don't be a stranger.
Oh, we will definitely be coming back, because we found out since then, our last time, that you guys have kangaroo rats.
We do, yes.
So
Yeah,
we've seen the little lizard,
yeah.
and we were like, oh, we got to go back for the rat. But we love the burrowing owls. And you're quite right. Both blocks are totally different, and both are worth visiting. But my question is, the last time we were there, which was 2 years ago, you did have a bison cull, and I was quite shocked to find we could purchase bison burgers from the shop. So my question is there any chance you guys are going to bring wolves? Like, wolves have been shown to have a big positive in Yellowstone. Might we get some in Grasslands?
Are the parks big enough for wolves?
Yeah, Jude, that's a great question there, and a great supplementary question as well, Ken. I'm going to take off my park hat and just put on my personal naturalist Nick hat on for a second to say, personally, not associating myself with Grasslands right now, I would love to see wolves back on Grasslands. That would be phenomenal. It'd be fantastic. But now I'm taking my naturalist Nick hat off and putting on my government hat, and I will say that unfortunately, because of the park and how it was formed on a willing seller, willing buyer fair basis. There was an agreement with the ranchers in the surrounding area, especially there was a lot of consultation done with the bison reintroduction in 2005 and how that would affect the landscape and the surrounding landscape. And a big sort of crux to the negotiations with surrounding landowners was that there would never be a wolf reintroductions in Grasslands National Park, simply because, as Ken puts there, the roam range for a pack of wolves is a lot larger than what grasslands can sort of support. And also the simple fact that wolves are very prolific hunters, and they would not, like all natural and wild animals, they would not respect the borders of the park, right? And if you can hunt, you know, there's quite a bit throughout the park and the surrounding area where there are Black Angus cattle and
Yes,
Hereford cattle and things like that. If you're a wild gray wolf and you can hunt, you know, a cattle with your pack a lot easier than you can hunt a plains bison, you're definitely going to go for that, right? So because
absolutely.
of that, I don't think there'll ever be a reintroduction of wolves into the environment there. In you know the future, or I'd have to look in more to the specifics of a roaming range for a pack of wolves, because I bet you know the area would be large enough to some degree, but again, it's that fact that they're going to go outside of the park and then be hunting private cattle and ranchers property, which would be cause a big issue. But again, switch my hat quickly, and when I run for prime minister, maybe I'll reintroduce wolves. Hat switching back on. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to order a sign right now for you to be on my front lawn. Thank you
Right
so
on,
much.
right
This
on.
was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank
You
you,
know,
Jude. Great
it's
questions.
funny, speaking of election signs, this is the first election that you don't really see any election signs out here. But I mean, you can't put an election sign on a snowbank
Well,
because the
they're
farmer's
under the
gonna
snow,
come over.
Ken.
Pardon?
Yeah.
They're under the snow.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't miss them, but I just say they're really not out there too much. Kimberly Wand has a question here, or an observation. When we were there last year, we noticed a large number of abandoned towns, buildings in areas south of Regina. The human population seems to have declined greatly in the past 40 years. Are these areas naturally reclaiming themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in my understanding, unfortunately, a lot of what's happening to small town Saskatchewan and Southwest Saskatchewan in particular is a lot of people are leaving small towns and moving to larger cities like Regina and Saskatoon or elsewhere across the country. So just anecdotally speaking with colleagues and locals in the town that I live in, a lot of kids and stuff, you know, they're moving to Medicine Hat, they're moving away, they're not continuing with the ranching and their property there. And then the family, or sometimes what they'll do is they're selling out. Like a lot of the land around Grasslands in particular is owned by sort of, I think, 4 to 6 families or organizations that buy up all the land. So we're really losing that wide variety of smaller ranchers, and it's all sort of becoming, you know, just larger operations that buy up smaller ones and get bigger and bigger kind of thing. So, unfortunately, yeah, a lot of land goes to disrepair and things like that. I don't, to a degree, I think some of it could be considered like being reclaimed naturally. However, a lot of that land, it's either more profitable for the private landowner to either convert the land to agriculture, or it's already sort of non-native crop that I wouldn't necessarily call invasive, but maybe naturalized, like non-native crested wheatgrass or smooth brome that was planted by ranchers, excuse me, to feed their cattle. It outcompetes some of the native species and then sort of takes over. Grasslands is interesting too, in that because we are land that was acquired from ranchers, we do have large areas of smooth brome and crested wheatgrass. But the park, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but the park actually does swath and bale and take that and either use it to feed the or sorry, that the land is, I believe, actually contracted out to people who bail and will take it out of the park and use it to feed their cattle. So it's sort of interesting in that perspective. But it's difficult. There's lots of positive organizations like Nature Saskatchewan and Ducks Unlimited Canada and things like that that will actually pay landowners to sort of keep native prairie intact or keep water sources intact to provide in the prairie pothole region migration habitat for waterfowl and things like that. But in terms of sort of those areas that you may have seen that are sort of don't look as inhabited as they are. Another thing too that I will note is what I've heard from colleagues and things like that is your land as a rancher is never one piece, right? You buy up land where you can, so they maybe let the farmhouse go to disrepair, but they might be ranching and coming in and bringing their cattle, letting them graze for an X amount of period, and then grabbing them the trailer and moving them to different property or community pasture and things like that. But that tends to be the trend from my understanding there. Hopefully that answers your question, and apologies if it doesn't.
Just one other thing before we can, you've got a few more questions to continue, but I should have told everybody before, when you do put a question in the chat, make sure it says it's to the meeting group chat. Zoom lets you talk among yourselves as you want. You can pass notes in class and we wouldn't see them. But meeting group chat will see your question. So Paul Rollinson here was asking, I think he's asking about the land between the two parks. And you mentioned that it was deemed too low quality to be included in the park. He sort of asked, how long would it take to retrieve or revive the land between the parks if it was available? We hear
Yeah,
a lot about connectivity of these, but I imagine in that area, connectivity north-south is maybe more important than east-west. And maybe
yeah.
just my addition to that question, I'm wondering whether you have any outreach with your park with similar areas south of you in the States.
Yeah, so great question there, Paul. I think currently the most recent management plan for Grasslands National Park, and that's a document that's supposed to be updated, I think, every 15 to 20 years. I think the most recent update was 2017. And the park management plan outlines just with the current staffing resources and financial resources, they are focusing more on the current blocks that we have at the moment. So that land in between maybe down the line with greater staffing capacity would be able to sort of have that be acquired and then eventually converted to native prairie so that you do have that one connected piece of land between the two blocks. However, right now, even within the east and west blocks, there's areas that are currently under restoration, like that whole seed collection and replanting of the seed. That's because that's those non-native species, smooth brome or crested wheatgrass, are sort of in the area. So we remove all those, or invasive species, remove all those, and then we're focusing on that reseeding and reclamation of land within those blocks currently. So I think there's, ongoing management plans for each of the various blocks. I know there's a larger push for invasive species in the east block, and then more sort of habitat restoration and rehabilitation in the west block. Maybe in the future, when that's sort of at a stronger level, then they would maybe look at acquiring the land in between. But right now, it's sort of not in the management plan at the moment. The other thing too that's really tricky with grasslands is you need sort of a town or like a home base for staff. I live in Val-Marie, which is sort of the main town right next to the West Block, and that's where the majority of the staff are based out of for the West Block activities, and then we'll even drive the 2.5 hours to the East Block to do work there. And with Val-Marie being close proximity to the West Block, a lot of people are there. The East Block, there's no town that's sort of a Val-Marie equivalent in the East Block. The closest town is a lot further away. So it's very difficult to staff people in the East Block of the park. So that's sort of an issue for sort of maintaining, if we did have an area in between there, there's not necessarily a town that sort of has a thriving local economy that could maybe support or sustain staff and people in there, because even going from the east block or the west block to the east block, you need to make sure you've got all your groceries and everything that you're getting either in Val-Marie and going out there. It's a lot more remote in that sense.
If a naturalist had to choose which block to visit, which one?
Yeah, that's a great question there, Ken. I would say if you're wanting to see wildlife, the West Block is sort of a better chance for the whole suite of your plains bison, your burrowing owl, your prairie rattlesnake, your greater shorthorn lizard and stuff. They tend to have a higher concentration in the West Block because that's more of the Frenchman River Valley rolling hills, versus the East Block is the home of dinosaurs in Canada. So the first fossils found in Canada were found in the East Block of the park, and it's more Badlands-esque. It was like a different geological formations formed those environments. However, the East Block is a phenomenal place for certain species such as smooth green snake or prairie falcon, or even greater sage grouse, I would say, has a higher chance of seeing that in the East Block than you do at the West Block. But the West Block is the wildlife one, I would say.
And I think we might have our last question. So if anybody else has a burning question, get your hand up real quick or get it in the chat. But Kate Harries, I think you covered some of this, but Kate's our invasive plant species specialist in the club, and I think she just wants you to go over again what some of the invasive species are that you're dealing with in the park. Which ones are on threat?
Yeah, for sure. So a big one, Kate, is the smooth or the leafy spurge is sort of the biggest one. That's a non-native annual plant, I believe, that is sort of the biggest issue that we're tackling a lot of. Last year we had a big issue with yellow sweet clover, which is on a personal note for me, it tends to consume those slopey environments that are really prime microhabitat for greater shorthorn lizards. So sweet yellow clover is enemy number one as far as I'm concerned in a personal perspective. But leafy spurge is sort of the big one that a lot of park resources are going towards right now. So they had a prescribed burn in the East Block to sort of get rid of them over there last year. Hopefully they'll be able to do another one. There's a lot of chemical spraying and manual removal that goes on for leafy spurge at the moment. And then additionally, there's our Canada thistle, absinthe wormwood, and field bindwood are sort of other species that are very high on the removal list. But again, it's very resource dependent on staffing levels and stuff. And with any government organization, we sort of apply for our funding on a timeline basis. And I think we're coming up to the end of our current strategy right now. So we'll have to reapply and see sort of what are the feasible priorities for that. But those are those are our priorities for invasive species. Leafy spurge, number one for sure, and then followed by those other 4 species.
Just a question on the leafy spurge. Was that introduced accidentally, or was it was it bought as something that had a useful purpose?
That's a good question. I honestly, off the top of my head, am unsure of it. I think it maybe is an accidental increase because I can't see it like it's a wildflower, so I don't see it having nutritional value from a ranching perspective. Like I didn't include our grasses like our crested wheatgrass, our smooth brome, and Japanese brome and things like that. But especially the first 2 there, those were definitely brought in by ranchers to sustain their cattle through the winter and for harvesting like that. But leafy spurge, I'm unsure. I'll do some research in that, and then perhaps I can send along a better answer via Ken, or maybe I can get your email from one of them and follow up with you there, Kate.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Great question.
And over to Bob. Are you unmuted, Bob?
I am now.
Just before you go, Bob, I just want to remind people to hang around a bit. We are going to ask for your sightings. I've got a little story to share. And the other thing you do before you go, if you go in the meeting group chat, you can leave your reviews of Nick's presentation and any compliments or things you'd like to say about them, and we'll share that with Nick later on. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, this wasn't going to be my question, but Kate brought up the invasive species, and you mentioned a couple of times using chemicals. Kate will tell you that a few of the field gnats are members of MTM Conservation, you're probably aware of. And Kate spearheaded a movement to try and get rid of the invasive Phragmites in Tiny Marsh. And we did apply chemicals. People freak out about it. How does a national park deal with this? Because I mean, I was taken aback. We were very careful to use it only where nothing else would work. And it was successful, highly successful, but people still freak out about it. I'm just curious how you deal with that.
And the other thing, Bob, just to add to that, there's been some discussion of introducing a biological control. And I think even some of our naturalists, that makes them nervous, but it tends to freak people out.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great question, and that's really great to hear. Phragmites was a big priority of mine when I was working at Awenda to sort of tackle the populations within the park there, and it's really good to hear that you're seeing some positive results there with some chemical control there. In terms of your question of application, how we get away with it, I will say in grasslands it is like a very remote area. And there is consultation, with surrounding landowners and stakeholders in the area as well before any sort of both chemical or prescribed burns or anything like that we do that's sort of a mechanical alteration of the landscape. There's always stakeholder consultation and sort of hoops to jump through, I guess, to tackle these invasive species. But in the case of the East Block of the park, it is sort of a remote environment, so we do have licensed pesticide or herbicide applicators within our team there that follow all the protocols set out by both the federal and then the provincial Saskatchewan government as well, to sort of apply in a safe and appropriate manner for these herbicides in the case of our leafy spurge there. It is interesting when we talk about biological control. I was just at a conference with some colleagues from Ducks Unlimited a couple of weeks ago about Phragmites and natural controls, and a former colleague of mine from the University of Toronto was doing some work in Professor Sandy Smith's lab in University of Toronto Scarborough, and she's sort of spearheading a lot of the biological control for Phragmites and the moth species that they're using for that. So it's really fascinating to hear that they're actually, doing that live release of that moth species and seeing how effective it is. So it'll be interesting to see from a personal standpoint that if that is successful, sort of if that will open the door for more research and investigation into further biological control, especially for stem boring species like moths like that we know in Europe and in their native habitats that they're able to sort of do some good. But then, of course, there's always question marks of research and biocontrol like that. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I agree. It's a very fascinating topic, and always a tricky one with landowners and people. And I think with Phragmites too, people always get concerned because it's a semi-aquatic or an aquatic invasive species, right? That distribution through water and things like that, or dissemination and half-life of the chemicals you're using can be really important and stuff. But that's what they pay the big bucks to our plant ecologists and people like that for, right? So it's good to know though, and really awesome to hear that you guys have had some good success in Tiny Marsh there, because it's another beautiful natural area in the Midland-Penetang area for sure.
Well, I want to make it perfectly 100% clear. None of the success is due to me. It's all Kate. Kate spearheaded this, and I give her all the credit here. But I was really hoping you'd give us some advice on how to deal with some of these irate people when they hear that we've been using even the most benign chemicals we can get our hands on. I think way is not an option for us.
Yeah, it's difficult too because people have such a emotional reaction because they care about the environment, right? But I'm a firm believer in interpretation and education, and sort of it's hard because people get really heightened and they're passionate about it, so it's hard to maybe talk to them from that scientific background and understanding that what you're doing, you've gone through the appropriate checks, you've consulted the appropriate people, you can explain the half-life of the herbicide you're using and things like that. And sometimes it's still not enough, right? But it is why we do what we do as an educator and interpreter, is hoping to change people's hearts and minds on something. And they obviously care greatly about the environment, but there's maybe some more education that could go. And that's my personal perspective. There's obviously no one blanket way to sort of help people to not be irate. But I think if they can see the effects over the term, that there's less of this ugly reed that's taken over, this wonderful habitat for native species and plants like that, maybe that's enough slowly and slowly. So keep doing what you're doing, and especially, presentations and opportunities like this for people like myself, and even Kate, yourself, and just getting out and talking to people makes a huge difference. And yeah, keep it up.
If you're back in this part of the world in the summer, drop in a Tiny Martian and see the great work that Kate and her team have done. It's just
we'd
really,
be glad
really
to show. We'd be glad to show you what we've done, and I think that like there's expanded areas for the black terns to nest, and there's the turtles can get onto the dikes, and there's so many benefits to wildlife that we can tell people about.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping to be able to come back at some point in the summer, because I love coming up to the Midland area in May and June and stuff. But we'll see what the future holds for sure.
And you better be ready for all these Midland people coming to the grasslands. How do they find you? They go to the western part and look for you there?
Yeah, most definitely. I'm based out of the west block of the park, so if you're in the visitor center in Val-Marie, just drop my name there, and my office is right in there. I'll be happy to pop out. I can send out an email with our program schedule there to you, Ken, for you to forward along. But we do guided
That'd be
hikes
great.
three times.
Send it to me as soon as you can, and I'll send it out with the recording of the meeting. That'd be a nice
Oh,
addition.
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. But
And
yeah, I was just going to say, we run guided hikes, which are sort of a good overview, similar to the presentation today, but you're going to be on the landscape and going off trail and into the wilderness of Grasslands National Park. We do that 3 times a week on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. We've got an evening programs in the campground every Friday night, I think, and then we have special events throughout the summer. So that includes our annual astronomy event, which is May 23rd and 24th this year, as well as specialist spotlights on our work that we do with burrowing owls, plains bison, and prairie rattlesnake, all of which can be found on the Grasslands National Park Parks Canada website. I'll send these links and dates along if anyone is interested there. I'll send them along to Ken, and perhaps Ken or Bob could forward them along. And also too, if you're visiting and sort of and passing through or whatever, and you're not in time for a program, yeah, just pop into the visitor center and mention my name. I'm happy to show people around and point you in the right direction for any species of interest or anything at all. It's my pleasure and my job and especially for people from the Midland Penetang area, always happy to see you guys make the journey out to Saskatchewan.
Bob, your hand's up again?
Well, that's the initial question that I didn't ask was, I was curious whether there are any counterparts to Grasslands National Park in the area to the south of us, our friends in the United States, because I always worry. You mentioned a lot of the species are migratory and they need wintering areas. Are they going to be safe? Are these wintering areas protected? Anything you could tell me about that? I'm really curious.
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob, there. So there's a lot of like trans-border organizations and conferences, like the Prairie Conservation Action Plan. That's an organization, and a few like prairie conservation core groups that Grasslands usually will send a delegation if they have a conference or a big planning meeting to these types of things, where we're able to sort of compare notes and touch base with our counterparts in the US park system. I know there's a lot of communication with regards to certain species recovery plans or species actions plans. So for our black-footed ferret, for example. We actually had a lot of partnership with the Calgary Zoo and the Wilder Institute in Alberta, and they were responsible, along with the Toronto Zoo, actually, shout out to our Ontario counterparts here. They were responsible for the head starting and breeding for black-footed ferrets that were eventually released in Grasslands National Park in 2009. And then a lot of that is sort of communicating, okay, what is the best practices, what worked for you guys in the States, because they're sort of ahead of us in a way with some of their head starting and reintroduction programs for black-footed ferret in particular, or black-tailed prairie dog. So there's a lot of that for specific species, and for bison as well. When we did bison reintroduction in 2005, there was big consultation with a colleague of mine from Grasslands, and a whole bunch of the ranchers in the surrounding area went down to Badlands National Park in South Dakota, and there was sort of discussions with them and how the bison in that particular national park, which is also a mixed grass prairie park, how they sort of interacted with the environment, and sort of what was the repercussions after, you know, a year of introduction, 5 years of introduction, 10 years introduction. And that really helped to convince a lot of the local ranchers that, okay, this bison introduction could be sort of you know, something that they could get on board with. So we're very grateful for them and our friends and colleagues down south of the border. A lot of it, you know, stems from that species at risk and certain action plans. A big one too is greater sage grouse. We're usually in contact with Montana, in particular, the state organizations there. They actually have large populations of greater sage grouse that do quite well in Montana. Like I think there's no regulation against hunting them. Like, they're not a species at risk in Montana, and they're quite prevalent. And then yet here in Canada, we have, you know, very few hundred left in all of the country. So it's sort of interesting. And again, those species that have a range that's beyond that. In Canada in particular, it's fascinating. And I'm sure Niall spoke a bit about this with his research on turtles and salamanders in Algonquin. With a lot of these species that have wide ranges in North America, Canada typically is at that northern range limit, meaning that the conditions that we see for them are very different from species in sort of a central part of their range that might be in the central United States. And this allows us, right, with climate change, to see how they're reacting to the very most extreme temperatures. Maybe that's extreme heat or extreme cool. In the case of grasslands, with our black-tailed prairie dogs, for example, they hibernate here in Grasslands National Park, versus in Badlands and further south, like southern Montana and Wyoming, and some of those ones where they do have prairie dogs, they don't hibernate. So it's sort of the interesting research that goes on, not just in the park, but also with external research partners from universities and colleges throughout, where we sort of have that sort of crossover with information. That being said, we'll see what happens this year in particular, with recent developments in a federal landscape of who's still around in the U.S. national park system, to sort of touch base and exchange ideas with, and if there will be tighter regulations and things like that. But sorry, I feel like I rambled a little bit there, Bob, but to
No,
answer your
that's all
question,
right.
there is that connection, and it's more so for specific species at risk or specific scenarios and things. I'm also speaking from my anecdotal experience of more on the wildlife, of the fauna side of things, the flora and plant life kind of thing. I'm sure there is sort of discussions as well, but I'm not as familiar with maybe how those ones operate. But I know for animals, it's those species at risk that get that really interesting crossover of information with our counterparts down south.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you for the presentation. It's very enlightening. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, thank
No
you very,
problem. Thank you guys for having me.
thank you very much, Nick. And the last comment we have, Tim Tully put a comment here. Thank you for the kind words, and talk to you before you go. She wants, so you have to make sure you hook up with Tim in a little while. But anyways, I'm going to take the
Definitely.
spotlight off you, Nick, and thanks very much. And we'll go on to the sightings part of the meeting. Everybody ready?
Thank you guys again for having me. I'm gonna skedaddle now, but I hope you all have a great evening and thank you for your time and listening. And like I said, if you're ever passing through Grasslands National Park, make sure you look me up and I'll be happy to point you in the right direction for certain things or take you on a guided hike. Take care and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
So
Thanks,
Bob,
Nick.
you got, if anybody's got sightings, they want to tell us what they see in the last month or so, Bob will chair this part of the meeting, but I might uh, volunteer to go first. Is that okay, Bob?
Yeah, please do, Ken. You got a great story, so I was hoping you'd tell it. So do.
Let me just share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yep.
This happened back on February 8th. I had to go to Aurelia for my choir in Aurelia was having an all-day practice because we've got a concert coming up in a week or so. We have to get ready for. And but I decided I'd go over to really a little early before the practice started at 9 o'clock to do a little bird watching in Kitchener Park, which is near the Aurelia Waste Transfer Facility on Lake Couchiching. And I birded there a little bit, didn't see anything too interesting. And I was about to leave around 7:30 in the morning, and as I go into my car, I'd see some wings flapping in the woods. And I went to investigate, and there was a red-tailed hawk there, and it didn't seem to be able to move. Wasn't taking off when I approached or anything, and so I looked at it more closely. And this is a photo I took after I freed it, but it had somehow got some twine wrapped around its right leg, and when it went into the bush, that twine got snagged on some branches, and it was trapped. It couldn't move. This was quite early in the morning. The hawk was flapping its wings trying, but it wasn't very active. I think it might have been there trapped there all night, and it looked pretty tired and whacked out. And of course, this is around 7:30 in the morning. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I was supposed to get to choir practice. I phoned Shades of Hope down in Pefferlo, the wildlife rescue people there. And a very nice lady answered the phone at 7:30 in the morning. I was surprised anybody picked up the phone. Those wildlife rescue people, they must be on call 24/7. But she gave me the answer I more or less expected, that yes, they could help this hawk, but they couldn't come get it. Somebody was going to have to get the hawk to them in Pefferlaw, which was about 45 minutes away. And I wasn't sure if that could be me. I didn't have anything to carry the hawk in, and I was supposed to be at choir practice. I wasn't sure what the lady from Chase Hope, why don't you take a picture of the hawk and put it on Facebook? Maybe somebody will come and pick it up. And so I took the picture. I wasn't sure if I should even leave the hawk. It was kind of exposed there. There's probably coyotes in the park and stuff. But by this time, the waste transfer facility started to open up, and along comes the gate had been opened, and along comes this snowplow out of the waste. Great big snowplow comes out of the waste transfer facility. And this was the day after the big storm in Aurelia, and I guess the snowplow was plowing the road into the waste transfer facility. I wasn't sure, I figure if you go up and you stop and try to hail a snowplow, that the snowplow plower is probably just going to say, "Get out of my way, I got a job to do." But no, the snowplow driver, who's Dave Doyle that you see here, I couldn't have stopped a better, more helpful citizen. As soon as I told him there was a bird in trouble, he hopped out of the snowplow, said, "Show me the bird," and he said, "Well." He just jumped right into action. So I got my big work gloves in the snowplow. He put those on. Between the two of us, I stood in front of the bird and kind of distracted it, and Dave grabbed it from behind. And I had already freed the bird, but it wasn't flying, and it was only moving on one leg. So it obviously seemed that its right leg had been injured somehow or other. But Dave, we grabbed the bird, and Dave said, "Well, I'll hop in your car. We'll drive back into the waste facility, and we can at least get it warm." And he put it in a building there. He put it in a milk crate to keep it from banging into too much. And Dave just sort of said, well, I'll take care of things from here. And he phoned Shades of Hope again, I guess, and told them that we have the bird and somebody was going to deliver it. So I got to my choir practice. I was only a little bit late. And at the lunchtime, I phoned Dave and said, well, how'd you make out with the bird? And he said, well, I thought I was probably going to take it down to Pefferlaw at the end of my shift, but I phoned my supervisor and told her about the bird. And my supervisor said, well, I'll come in and I'll take the bird down to Pefferlaw. So the bird got there down to Shades of Hope. And it was a good story all around. And I really appreciate Dave's help on it. And today we just got the good news. See if I can show the result here. There's Dave releasing the hawk back into Kitchener Park in Aurelia. Apparently there really wasn't all that much damage to its leg. It just needed a couple of weeks rest and recovery, and the leg kind of healed itself. There was no surgery or anything. They treated the bird for parasites, which parasites are just kind of par for the course when you're a wild animal. And the bird's flying around again over Kitchener Park. And Dave mentioned that over the last couple of weeks, he's seen another red-tailed hawk circling around the area. And we think that might have been this, Shades of Hope said this was a male. It might have been this male's mate. So hopefully they're back together and ready for the breeding season. I shared some of the story originally on a whole bunch of Facebook sites, and people were quite taken. I think they were particularly taken with the proud look on Dave's face there. And we were up to about 3,000 likes on Facebook. So today I posted the good result, and I'm suggesting to people that instead of likes on Facebook, they all make a $10 one-time donation to Shades of Hope. And if the 3,000 people that liked us on Facebook did that, that would be $30,000 for Shades of Hope, which would be quite something. So we'll see. A lot of people have told me they've already donated, and if anybody here wants to donate, you can go on Shades of Hope website, and it's very easy to do. So I think that's my story. I'm just going to unshare my screen here if I can figure out how to do that.
Well, there's only one problem now. Nobody can top a story like that, Ken. I mean, that's just a wonderful thing you did, and you deserve a round of applause from everybody.
Well, it's really David Doyle who did most of the work. I mean, I was stuck there just wondering what I was going to do with this bird, and David took over and did most of the work. So, but I'm glad it was a good result, and that the bird is back in Kitchener Park.
Well
Anybody
done.
else got any stories or things to tell us?
Well, I have one sighting. It's not that exciting. It's not a red-tailed hawk being saved from certain death. But on February the 4th, Sue and I walked the Cowan Trail, which was quite covered in snow, and we saw exactly one bird of one species of bird. That was a robin. And all you people who think that robins are a sign of spring, since that day, it hasn't stopped snowing. And I don't think the temperature's been above freezing once. So this is not a reliable sign of spring.
No, I better stick with the groundhog, do you think?
I don't think he's trustworthy either.
No. Oh, well, what can you do?
Somebody else must have a sighting.
I have a sighting, a little.
Okay, let me find you, Chris,
Okay.
and we'll put a pin on you.
Ouch.
There. Okay, go ahead. What's your sighting?
Well, it's a bit of a story here. We used to have for several years we had a rabbit we could identify because it had a big chomp out of one of its ears, and it raised several generations of kits, which is what you call a baby bunny, on our property. And we had many adventures. We'd see it hiding from foxes and hawks and all kinds of things. So anyways, it disappeared last year, and this year we're doing the Project Feeder Watch, and I noticed that the one day this bunny just peeled out of one of our areas where we were feeding birds and was running around. So that was great. We got to add another mammal to our Project Feeder Watch. So it's pretty exciting. And then the other day was the full moon on 12th, I think it was. I had to get up after midnight, which I often do, and went to the bathroom and I looked out the window to see if I could see the bunny in the full moonlight, because they're often somewhat nocturnal. And I couldn't see it anywhere, but I did see something, and it was sort of a triangular shape on the ground, but I couldn't, it looked like maybe it's just one of the pine boughs or something. I wasn't sure. So I went downstairs, got my binoculars, and had a look out, and there was a barred owl on the bunny.
Oh, dear.
So it's a bit gruesome that way, but it's part of nature. And then it was very interesting because for the next few nights, here was the owl back on the bunny. It would disappear in the daytime, but David Hawk, as we know, does that article, and I don't know if anybody saw it, but he did one where the same sort of thing happened on his property about a month ago, and he wrote a story about 3 weeks ago about how these owls and things like that, when they get a prey like that, and you know how cold it is, well, of course it freezes solid, so they sit on this dead bunny for long enough till enough of it thaws out that they can make a meal out of it, and they keep returning to the
Because they don't have microwaves, do they?
no microwaves. That's exactly what I was going to say, but yeah. Well, that's my little bird feeder story, and we feed the birds in more than one way.
Yeah.
The bunny ate the bird feed, and then the owl ate the bunny.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Welcome.
And anybody else got anything they've seen besides snow recently?
It's Jude. I just wanted to say I had the pleasure.
Who's this?
It's Jude.
Jude. Okay, let me find you again, Jude.
Oh, I'm not on screen. I'm just
Okay, go
voice.
ahead then.
So about 3 weeks ago, I went out to Fort Saskatchewan, which is north of Edmonton, because of the great gray owl eruption. And I managed to see 29 great grays.
Ooh.
Managed to find a northern pygmy. We had a boreal, we had a hawk owl, and a short-eared.
And where are you joining us from today, Jude?
I'm down in Toronto. I'm actually coming up to Midland on Saturday.
Okay. Somebody had a boreal owl down in Toronto. I think maybe by, what is it, sir? That one park down there. Anyways, those are a lovely group of owls to see.
Absolutely.
Anybody else before we call tonight? Speak up now, or wherever hold your sighting till next month. Speaking of next month, our next meeting will be on Zoom again. And then in April will be in person, but next month we've got, I think she's going to be joining us all the way from Victoria, BC. It's an author named Sarah Cox, and she's written a book called Signs of Life, Field Notes from the Front Lines of Extinction. And when you put that word extinction in there, it always sounds like a bit of a downer, but I think the book actually tells about a lot of the positive things that people all over Canada and all over the world are doing to fight this extinction crisis. So hopefully there'll be some good news stories in there in the presentation. So I think with that, Bob, if you got anything else before we bang your gavel and call it a night?
I have nothing to add except to thank you, Ken, as always, for putting these Zoom presentations together and getting us such inspiring guest speakers. So thank you, Ken.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks to everybody for coming. And I'm going to stop the recording.